A German Shepherd puppy stumbled into a snow-covered road with a dented food bowl in his mouth. A former Navy SEAL hit the brakes and stopped only a few feet away. Food spilled across the snow, but the puppy ignored every bite and kept looking back at him. When the man stepped closer, the puppy grabbed the bowl and led him toward a broken fence. Beyond it, an aging dog was waiting beside the dark home of the owner he had lost. Someone had promised the dog would never be forgotten, but another winter storm was already closing in. Where are you watching from today? Stay until the end, share what this story meant to you, and please like and subscribe as we work toward our first 100 subscribers. The German Shepherd puppy appeared so suddenly that Caleb Ward had time for only one clear thought. Not the dog. His right boot struck the brake. The old pickup shuddered, its tires losing their grip on the packed snow as the truck slid sideways across Pine Hollow's narrow main road. A paper sack of canned goods tipped over behind the passenger seat. 2 jars rolled beneath the dashboard. Caleb held the wheel steady instead of fighting it, waiting until the tires found the rough edge of the road. The truck stopped with its front bumper less than 6 feet from the puppy. For one long second, nothing moved. Then, an aluminum bowl dropped from the puppy's mouth and struck the snow with a dull metallic sound. Several pieces of softened dog food scattered across the white surface. Caleb switched on the hazard lights and let out the breath he had been holding. At 55, Caleb had been away from the Navy SEAL teams for years, but some parts of that life had never left him. He still noticed exits before furniture, weather before conversation, and small movements before the larger scene around them. Those habits now served him in quieter work. He inspected power lines and mountain communication routes, searching for damaged poles, loose junction boxes, and the early signs of trouble that winter often hid beneath something clean and beautiful. That afternoon, Caleb had been returning from the Pine Hollow grocery store with enough supplies to last through the next storm. His cabin stood several miles beyond the village, where the last houses gave way to thick pine forest. He had expected to be home before darkness, with coffee heating on the stove, and no voice in the room except the weather radio. The puppy changed that plan. Caleb looked through the windshield. The young German Shepherd stood in the middle of the road, on legs that seemed too large for the rest of him. His coat was warm, golden brown with soft black markings beginning to spread across his back. One ear stood almost upright. The other leaned outward, as though it had not yet decided what kind of dog it wanted to become. The puppy was frightened by the truck, but not frozen with fear. His eyes remained fixed on the bowl. Caleb opened the door slowly and stepped down into ankle-deep snow. "Easy," he said. The puppy glanced at him, then lowered his head and picked up the bowl by its dented rim. He did not eat the scattered food. Instead, the puppy turned toward the far end of the village and began running. Running was a generous word for it. His front paws lifted too high, his back legs slipped, and the aluminum bowl swung from side to side. After 15 yards, he stopped and looked back at Caleb. Caleb stayed beside the truck. The puppy took 3 more steps, stopped again, and stared. There was purpose in that small body. Not training, not the polished control of a working dog. Something simpler and more urgent. Caleb closed the truck door, but left the engine running. The puppy came back. He crossed the distance between them, pressed his cold nose against the lower leg of Caleb's work pants, then turned once more toward the end of the road. The message was not difficult to understand. "Follow me." Before Caleb could move, the front door of Pine Hollow General Store opened behind him. Warm yellow light spilled across the snow, followed by the voice of Mabel Cross, the 68-year-old owner who seemed to know every grocery list, family disagreement, and overdue roof repair in the village. "You nearly hit Walter Boone's dog," Mabel called. Caleb turned. Mabel stood on the wooden step, wearing a cranberry-colored sweater beneath a green shop apron. Her gray hair curled close around her ears, and her tortoiseshell glasses hung from a red cord against her chest. Two men in winter coats stood behind her, watching the puppy with the quiet interest of people who had already formed an opinion. The puppy stopped several yards away. He still held the bowl. Caleb asked whether the dog often ran into the road. "Lately, he runs everywhere with that bowl," Mabel said. "Name's Milo. Belongs to Walter Boone, the old veteran at the edge of the village." That was the first time Caleb heard the puppy's name. Milo's almost straight ear turned at the sound, but he did not approach Mabel. He looked toward the end of the road again. Mabel stepped carefully onto the snow. Her concern appeared genuine, but so did the certainty beneath it. She explained that Walter was 78, lived alone, and had become harder to deal with since his wife died. People had seen Milo leaving the property with the same bowl several times during the past week. One of the men behind Mabel added that Walter could barely manage his own steps in bad weather. Mabel lowered her voice. "Some of us think that puppy is looking for food." Caleb looked at the pieces scattered near the truck. Milo could have eaten every one of them before anyone reached him. He had not even smelled them. The puppy's ribs did not show beneath his winter coat. His eyes were clear. There was no desperate swallowing, no frantic searching near the store entrance, where the scents of bread, smoked meat, and pet food drifted through the opening door. His paws were wet, but not cracked. His nails had been trimmed recently. None of those details proved Walter was capable of caring for him, but they did prove the story was not as simple as it sounded. Caleb had learned long ago that people often saw what fear prepared them to see. A man alone became dangerous. An old man became helpless. A dog carrying an empty bowl became hungry. Sometimes those conclusions were correct. Sometimes they were only convenient. Milo dropped the bowl again. This time, instead of waiting, he hurried back and placed one oversized paw on Caleb's boot. The puppy made a soft, impatient sound in his throat. Mabel watched the gesture. "He's never done that with me," she said. Caleb bent just enough to let Milo smell the back of his fingers. The puppy drew in one quick breath, then pulled away and ran toward the last row of houses. Caleb made his choice. "I'm going to see where he's headed." Mabel's expression tightened with relief and worry at the same time. She told Caleb to be careful with Walter. The old veteran did not welcome visitors, especially visitors who arrived believing he needed to be managed. Caleb understood that kind of man better than Mabel knew. There had been a time when Caleb believed every dangerous situation required one person to take control. That belief had saved lives. It had also taught him to mistake obedience for trust. Even now, when he saw a problem, his first instinct was to remove it from someone else's hands before asking whether those hands were ready to let go. He returned to the pickup and drove at walking speed behind Milo. The village narrowed around them. Low timber houses stood beneath heavy roofs of snow. Thin smoke rose from chimneys into the pale evening sky. Beyond the final street lamp, the forest pressed closer, dark green under white branches. Milo stayed near the roadside. Every few yards, he looked back to make sure the truck remained behind him. At the edge of Pine Hollow, the puppy turned into a short drive leading to a small wooden house with a deep front porch. The paint had faded to a weathered gray. A stack of split firewood stood beneath a canvas cover. Snow had been cleared from only half the front steps. Milo climbed onto the porch and dropped the bowl beside the door. Caleb parked far enough away not to block the drive. He had barely stepped from the truck when he noticed the first contradiction. A wide ceramic food bowl stood near the porch wall, filled almost to the top. Beside it sat a clean water dish on a low heated mat, the thin cord disappearing through a protected opening near the door. A folded towel rested on a wooden stool, placed at the right height for wiping muddy paws. This was not proof of a perfect home, but it was not the porch of a man who had forgotten his dog. Milo drank 2 small laps of water, then ignored the full food bowl. The front door opened. Walter Boone appeared behind the storm door, with one hand wrapped around an ashwood cane. He was thinner than Caleb expected, though his shoulders still showed the shape of the strong man he had once been. His white hair had been cut unevenly around the ears, and a thick white mustache sharpened the irritation already present in his pale blue eyes. Walter wore an old olive-gray wool coat over a brown and cream flannel shirt. A dark red knit cap covered part of his forehead. He looked first at Caleb, then at the pickup, then toward the distant store. "So, Mabel sent somebody this time," Walter said. Caleb remained at the bottom of the steps. "No one sent me. Your dog ran in front of my truck." Walter's grip tightened around the cane. "He's not your concern." The old man's voice had more strength than his posture. His right leg remained slightly behind the left, protected from full weight. Caleb explained that Milo had been carrying the aluminum bowl toward the road, and that several people believed the puppy was searching for food. Walter's expression changed, not into guilt, into humiliation. "There it is," Walter said. "A man gets old, and the whole village starts counting the things they think he can't do." Caleb glanced again at the full food bowl, the clean water, and the folded towel. "I'm counting what I can see." Walter gave a humorless laugh. "And what do you think you see?" Before Caleb could answer, Milo moved between them. The puppy set the dented aluminum bowl near the edge of the porch. Then he reached into his full food dish, picked up several softened pieces, and dropped them into the metal bowl one mouthful at a time. Walter went silent. Milo gripped the bowl again and carried it toward the side of the house. A wooden fence separated Walter's property from the neighboring yard. Several boards near the back had collapsed beneath old snow and the weight of a fallen branch. At the bottom, where one board had lifted away from the ground, there was a narrow opening. Milo lowered himself and pushed the bowl through. The opening was barely wide enough. His shoulders scraped the snow. His back legs kicked twice before he disappeared beneath the broken board. Caleb stepped closer. Walter remained on the porch. "Leave him be," the old man said, but the anger had gone out of his voice. From the other side of the fence came the soft scrape of metal moving across packed snow. Then a bark answered. It was low, rough, and tired, the sound of an old dog using what remained of its voice. Caleb looked through the broken section of fence. Milo stood several feet away in the neighboring yard. He placed the food on the snow, backed away, and lay down beside the bowl. He did not eat. He waited. The house beyond him was dark. Snow covered the porch steps. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no fresh human footprints crossed the yard. Only one trail disturbed the white ground. It began beside Milo and moved toward the silent house, the uneven prints of an old dog, with one rear paw dragging a faint line through the snow. Caleb Ward kept his eyes on the broken line of tracks beyond Walter Boone's fence. The marks were too uneven to belong to Milo. Each front paw had pressed cleanly into the snow, but one rear foot had dragged behind, leaving a thin groove between the prints. The trail crossed the neighboring yard and disappeared beside a dark wooden house where no chimney smoke rose into the evening air. On Walter's side of the fence, Milo remained flat against the snow beside the food he had carried over. The German Shepherd puppy did not bark or scratch at the ground. He simply watched the silent house and waited. Caleb moved toward the side of the property, searching for a gate. "There isn't one that opens anymore," Walter called from the porch. The old veteran had come down one step, though his right hand still held the ashwood cane, and most of his weight remained on his left leg. His anger had faded into something more guarded. Caleb asked how to reach the other yard. Walter pointed with the cane toward the eastern edge of both properties. "Go around the last fence post. Snow's deeper there than it looks." Caleb followed the fence until the ground dipped near a stand of young pines. The snow rose above his knees in places, forcing him to lift each leg carefully. Milo appeared on the other side of the boards and moved parallel to him, using a narrow trench pressed into the snow. The path was too worn to have been made in one afternoon. Milo had traveled it many times. Near the last fence post, the puppy's tracks changed direction. Some continued toward the neighboring yard, but others curved east through the pine trees before returning farther down. Caleb paused over them. The route into the woods looked older and less direct, its edges softened by fresh snow. Walter saw where Caleb was looking. "That used to be the way between the two houses," he said. "Before Eleanor put up the fence." The name meant nothing to Caleb yet, but Walter spoke it as though it should. Caleb rounded the fence and entered the neighboring yard. Milo hurried ahead with the empty bowl, his oversized paws throwing small fans of snow behind him. He led Caleb past a porch whose steps had not been cleared and around the side of the dark house. A small wooden shelter stood near the back wall. The roof leaned slightly under a heavy layer of snow. One side had been repaired with newer boards, but the door remained open several inches. Inside, Caleb could see the edge of a blue-gray wool blanket. Milo slipped through first. Caleb lowered himself near the doorway and waited for his eyes to adjust. An old dog lay on the blanket. Duke was a large Labrador Collie mix, though age had taken much of the fullness from his body. His coat was dark golden brown, with silver covering his muzzle, chest, and front legs. His eyes were cloudy but alert. When Caleb moved closer, Duke raised his head without standing. A red-brown leather collar rested loosely around his neck. The name on the brass tag read, Duke. A shallow water dish sat near the blanket. It held enough water to cover the bottom, and a small amount of softened food remained in another bowl. Duke was not starving, but the old dog had eaten little. His back leg stayed tucked beneath him, as though standing required careful thought. Milo carried the new food close, tipped the dented bowl onto its side, and pushed the pieces toward Duke. Duke smelled them, but did not eat. The puppy circled once, then lay against Duke's chest. Milo's small back fitted beneath the older dog's chin. For several seconds, Duke did nothing. Then his nose moved through the fur behind Milo's nearly upright ear. Only after Milo touched the bowl with his muzzle did Duke take the first piece. He chewed slowly. Milo stayed beside him. Caleb felt something in the scene settle into place. Milo had not simply learned where food could be found. He had learned where food was needed. More than that, the puppy seemed to understand that Duke would accept the meal only if he did not have to eat alone. Walter reached the yard by the longer route several minutes later. Each step cost him. His cane sank through the top crust of snow, and his right leg followed more slowly than the left. Caleb rose and moved toward him, but Walter stopped him with a look. "I can still cross my own ground," Walter said. Caleb did not point out that this was no longer Walter's ground. He waited until the older man reached the shelter. Walter rested one hand against the wall and looked inside. The change in his face was slight, but Caleb saw it. The hard lines around his mouth eased when he found Duke eating. "Eleanor Vance lived here," Walter said. "Duke was hers." Eleanor had been 76, Walter explained. She had lived alone in the small house for nearly 20 years. 3 weeks earlier, a neighbor found her struggling to breathe and called for medical help. Eleanor spent several days in the hospital before she died. Before the ambulance took her away, she gave Walter a spare key. "She knew she might not come back," Walter said. He looked toward Duke rather than at Caleb. Eleanor's son, Thomas Vance, lived several states away. Thomas had spoken to Walter by phone and asked him to care for Duke until he could return. Thomas's daughter had recently undergone surgery, and he was still at the hospital with her. He had promised to send written permission for Walter to manage Duke's care, but no document had arrived yet. Caleb asked how long Walter had been crossing the yard. "Twice a day at first," Walter said. "Morning and before dark." He had warmed Duke's food, changed the water, cleared snow from the shelter, and sometimes sat on an overturned bucket while the old dog slept. Duke had refused to enter Walter's house. Every time Walter tried to lead him away, Duke returned to Eleanor's back door or the wool blanket in the shelter. Then Walter had fallen. It happened 9 days earlier near the broken fence. The snow had hidden a patch of ice. His right leg folded, and the pain in his hip left him unable to stand. Walter told the story without asking for sympathy. He described the cold reaching through his coat and the way the sky had begun to darken above the pines. He had called out twice, but both houses stood too far from the road. Milo had been with him. The puppy had run back to Walter's porch, pulled one of Walter's brown gloves from beside the door, and carried it toward the road. A delivery driver saw the puppy dragging the glove through the snow and stopped. Walter had spent almost half an hour on the ground. The fall had not broken anything, but the swelling in his hip and knee made the deep snow nearly impossible after that. Caleb looked at Milo. The puppy had finished none of the food himself. He remained curled against Duke, eyes half closed, as if guarding the old dog's willingness to stay connected to the living. Walter had adapted after the fall. He placed extra food in Milo's bowl and let the puppy carry it across. He filled a narrow insulated bottle with warm water and pushed it through the opening beneath the fence using a long wooden pole. Every evening Walter stood at his back door and called Duke's name. Sometimes Duke answered. Sometimes only Milo returned. Caleb studied the shelter roof and the dark house beyond it. The solution that came to him was immediate and practical. "I can take Duke to my cabin tonight," Caleb said. "It's warm, quiet, and I've got room." Walter's shoulders stiffened. "No." Caleb explained that another storm could add weight to the roof. The shelter offered protection from wind, but not enough if the snow deepened. Duke's age made every hour in the cold harder. Walter listened until Caleb finished. Then he planted his cane more firmly in the snow. "You think moving him is the same as helping him?" "I think keeping him alive matters more than keeping him comfortable." Walter's pale eyes narrowed. "He is alive. For now." The words came out harder than Caleb intended. Duke stopped chewing. Milo raised his head. The puppy looked first toward Caleb, then toward Walter. He stood and crossed the few feet between them. Milo touched his nose to Walter's bare knuckles, waited until the old man's fingers rested against his head, then returned to the shelter and lay beside Duke again. The movement changed the silence. Milo had not chosen Walter over Duke, or Duke over Caleb's concern. The puppy moved between them, as though the distance itself were the problem. Walter's voice was quieter when he spoke again. Duke watched Eleanor leave in an ambulance. Then strangers came through the house. He's lost her voice, her footsteps, and every routine he understood. Walter looked through the open shelter door. "That blanket still smells like her. So does the back step. Maybe that doesn't mean much to you, but it means something to him." Caleb understood more than Walter realized. Years earlier, after leaving the teams, Caleb had kept an old field jacket hanging inside his cabin long after the fabric had become useless. He never wore it. He had only needed to know it remained where he left it. People called such objects memories. Animals simply stayed close to the scent. Caleb did not withdraw his concern. "The next storm won't care what that blanket means." Walter nodded once. "That's true." The answer surprised Caleb. Walter was not denying the danger. He was resisting the belief that danger erased every other truth. "Safety can become a fine word for taking choices away from somebody," Walter said, "especially when the person using it is stronger." Caleb looked at Walter's cane, then at Duke's stiff rear legs. He had heard versions of that sentence before, usually from men who feared becoming burdens. In the teams, Caleb had sometimes answered with orders. Orders were clear. They saved time. They also left little room for dignity. This time, he asked what Eleanor had wanted. Walter stared toward the empty house. Before being taken to the hospital, Eleanor had held his wrist and spoken through shallow breaths. She asked him not to let Duke be sent away before Thomas returned. Walter had promised. It had not been a legal agreement. There had been no witness except Duke standing near the kitchen doorway. But to Walter, that didn't make it smaller. "I gave her my word," he said. The old man's voice held no drama. That made the promise feel heavier. Caleb began to understand the shape of the situation. Walter was not neglecting the dogs. He had been trying to care for both while hiding how badly his own body had begun to fail him. Milo was not merely carrying food. The puppy was crossing a distance Walter could no longer cross without help. And Duke was not simply refusing shelter. He was waiting. Caleb stepped closer to the open door and lowered one hand. Duke smelled his fingers, but did not rise. Milo shifted enough to give the old dog room, then placed one paw across Duke's front leg. Caleb did not repeat the offer to take Duke away. Not yet. Instead, he asked Walter about the older path through the trees. Walter pointed east. Years earlier, before Eleanor built the fence to keep deer out of her garden, a narrow trail had connected the back doors of the two houses. The path crossed a shallow drainage line and curved around the densest pines. "Milo found part of it by scent," Walter said. "He uses it when the opening under the fence drifts shut." Caleb looked toward the trees again. The route would be longer, but might offer safer access if cleared. Fresh snow had softened Milo's tracks, yet the line was still visible where the puppy had passed beneath the branches. That path did not solve the shelter problem, but it gave Walter a way to remain involved without climbing through broken boards. The light was fading quickly. Caleb told Walter they needed to bring more water, inspect the shelter, and decide what could be done before night. Walter did not thank him. He only shifted his cane and said there was another insulated bottle near his porch. For the first time, the words sounded less like dismissal and more like permission. Milo rose when Caleb moved. The puppy left Duke long enough to follow Caleb toward the fallen garden chair near the fence. Half of the wooden seat had disappeared beneath wind-blown snow. Milo stopped beside it, his head lowered. He smelled the ground, moved 3 feet to the left, then began digging. At first, Caleb thought the puppy had found a buried scrap of food, but Milo ignored the frozen grass and kept working at one spot beneath the overturned chair. Snow flew backward between his legs. Walter came closer, breathing harder from the walk. "What has he got now?" Walter asked. Milo struck something solid. A small metallic sound rose from beneath the snow. Caleb knelt and brushed away the loose powder. Under the edge of a dark, oil-stained cloth, a rusted corner caught the last gray light of the afternoon. Something metal had been buried beside Eleanor Vance's fallen garden chair. The metal box came free only after Caleb Ward cleared the frozen soil from both sides. It was smaller than he had expected, no wider than a family Bible, and wrapped in a square of dark oilcloth. One hinge had rusted nearly shut. A narrow metal bracket remained attached to the bottom, along with 2 bent screws. Caleb looked toward the overturned garden chair. The empty space beneath its seat matched the bracket. Walter Boone understood at once. Eleanor Vance had fastened the box beneath the chair, where she often sat with Duke during warmer months. When the fence and chair fell in the earlier storm, the box had dropped into the snow and disappeared beneath the drift. Milo pushed his nose against the oilcloth. The German Shepherd puppy smelled one corner, then another. His nearly upright right ear turned toward Duke's shelter, while the left ear leaned sideways. He scratched once at the cloth and gave a quiet whine. Walter lowered himself carefully onto the standing half of the garden bench. That blanket was always beside Eleanor's chair. Caleb unfolded the cloth. Faint traces of blue-gray wool clung to one edge, along with the dry scent of old wood, and something softer that Walter said was Eleanor's lavender hand cream. Milo had not found the box by chance. He had followed a familiar smell back to something the snow had hidden. The lid resisted Caleb's first attempt. He used the flat edge of a small tool from his coat pocket, working slowly so the corroded metal would not tear. When the seal finally released, the hinge gave a tired creak. Inside were Duke's veterinary records, a spare brass key, 2 folded pages of feeding instructions, and a sealed envelope. The envelope carried one name: Thomas. Walter reached for it before Caleb could lift it from the box. The old man's fingers were stiff from cold, but his grip was certain. He examined the seal and the handwriting, then placed the envelope inside his coat. "That belongs to her son." Caleb said the letter might explain what Eleanor wanted done with Duke. Walter looked at him directly. "A private letter does not become public because the person who wrote it died." There was no anger in the statement, only a boundary. Caleb accepted it. They brought the box into Walter's kitchen, where the heat from an old iron stove slowly softened the cold in their hands. Milo lay near Walter's boots, with his nose resting over one front paw. Duke remained in the shelter next door, but the back door had been left open enough for Walter to hear if the old dog called. The veterinary records gave them the first useful information. Duke's vaccinations were current. His last examination had noted stiffness in the rear legs, reduced hearing, and the need for softened food. Eleanor's feeding instructions matched what Walter had already been doing. At the bottom of the page was Thomas Vance's telephone number. Walter placed the call from a corded phone mounted beside the kitchen doorway. Caleb stayed near the table, close enough to hear Walter's side, but not the voice on the line. Thomas answered after the 4th ring. Walter introduced himself, then explained that Caleb had found the metal box beneath the fallen garden chair. He told Thomas the sealed letter was safe and would remain unopened. The conversation became quieter after that. Thomas confirmed that Eleanor had asked Walter to care for Duke. He had spoken to his mother before she died and understood that Duke was still at the house. His daughter's surgery had gone well, but she was not yet able to remain alone. The hospital planned to reassess her within several days. Thomas promised he would return to Pine Hollow as soon as the doctor cleared her. Walter asked about written permission. Thomas had believed his earlier phone call would be enough. When Walter explained that official questions might be coming, Thomas apologized without defending himself. He asked for the email address of the county animal welfare office and the name of Duke's veterinary clinic. Caleb wrote both on a page from his orange inspection notebook. Before the call ended, Thomas agreed to send written authorization, allowing Walter to continue Duke's care and allowing Caleb to transport the dog if a medical need arose. Walter listened, then said something Caleb had not expected. "Your mother's letter is here. I won't open it." The old man paused while Thomas answered. "I'll keep it safe," Walter said. "You come read it yourself." When Walter hung up, his hand remained on the receiver for several seconds. The call had solved one problem. It had also made Thomas's absence more real. A son was trying to care for a living daughter, while the house of his dead mother waited beneath the snow. Duty had not failed. It had divided. Caleb had seen that happen before. People often judged absence by distance, without knowing what another person was standing beside. A vehicle entered Walter's driveway less than an hour later. It was a white county utility wagon, marked only by a small blue emblem on the door. The woman who stepped out wore a dark teal winter coat, charcoal waterproof pants, and black snow boots. Her black hair, touched with a few silver strands, had been braided low behind her neck. She carried a brown crossbody file bag and moved without hurry. Nora Hale introduced herself as an animal welfare officer for the county. At 47, She had spent enough years entering tense homes to know that speed could feel like accusation. Before touching Milo, she removed one glove and lowered the back of her fingers for him to smell. Milo approached, checked her hand, then returned to Walter. Nora noticed. She explained that her office had received a report claiming a German Shepherd puppy was being denied food and that an elderly dog remained alone at a property with no resident. Walter's mouth tightened. Nora did not ask him to calm down. She asked to see the animals. The inspection began with Milo. Nora checked his body condition: coat, paws, water, food, sleeping area, and vaccination paperwork. Walter brought out a blue-gray notebook from a kitchen drawer. Every page contained dates, feeding amounts, notes on stool, water intake, sleep, and the progress of Milo's ears. One entry recorded the day Milo's right ear stood for nearly 4 hours. Another noted that he tired quickly after walking in deep snow. Nora read several pages, then closed the book. "There is no evidence that Milo is being starved or neglected," she said. Walter looked toward the window, but some of the tightness left his jaw. Milo's trust had already told part of the truth. The notebook made it harder for anyone to dismiss. Duke's situation required a different answer. Nora crossed to Eleanor's property with Caleb and Walter. She examined the shelter, the food, the water container, and the path between the houses. Duke allowed her to observe from several feet away but did not rise. The old dog was receiving care. The problem was whether that care could continue safely. Nora explained that Duke was living on property without a resident. Walter's mobility was limited. The shelter roof carried heavy snow, and county forecasts showed another winter storm could reach Pine Hollow within 3 days. She had received Thomas's email while standing in Walter's kitchen. The message formally authorized Walter to provide temporary care and allowed Caleb to transport Duke for veterinary treatment. The legal responsibility was now clear. The practical responsibility was not. Before the storm, Nora needed 5 things documented: a regular schedule for checking Duke, reliable access through the snow, transportation if the dog needed medical care, a designated person responsible for daily decisions, and a temporary indoor location if the shelter became unsafe. Nora's tone remained measured. She did not threaten to take Duke permanently. She explained that if no safe plan existed, the old dog would need temporary placement with a foster household or county partner until Thomas returned. The distinction mattered, but Walter heard only the part about Duke being moved. Caleb responded before thinking. "He can stay at my cabin." Walter turned toward him so sharply that his cane slipped several inches in the snow. There it is again. Caleb knew what he meant. Another plan, another decision, another capable person announcing what would happen before asking Walter what he wanted. Caleb began to explain that his cabin was warm and quiet, but Walter's anger rose with every practical reason. Milo moved between them. The puppy pressed close to Walter's left leg and sat on the snow. He placed one paw on the toe of Walter's worn winter boot, then looked up at Nora. He did not hide behind Walter. He leaned into him. Nora lowered her clipboard. "That dog does not behave like he is afraid of you," she told Walter. The observation changed the direction of the moment. Nora was no longer speaking only as an officer evaluating a household. She was acknowledging a relationship. Walter rested one hand on Milo's head. Then he took the blue-gray notebook from inside his coat and opened to the pages devoted to Duke. Walter had recorded each visit, the amount the old dog ate, the condition of the water, whether Duke stood without help, and how long Milo remained beside him. Walter had even marked the days his own hip pain prevented a full visit. Nora studied the entries. "You know these dogs better than anyone here," she said. "But knowing them does not mean you have to be the only person available." Walter's eyes hardened again, though not as much as before. Nora continued carefully. Love is the reason for the plan. It cannot be the whole plan. The sentence stayed between them. Caleb looked at the old notebook, Milo's paw on Walter's boot, and the deep track Walter had made coming through the snow. He saw how easily help could become another form of removal. A stronger person stepped in, took the burden, and then called the loss of control a kindness. He closed his inspection notebook. "What do you want us to do?" Caleb asked. Walter looked at him. Caleb did not offer choices. He did not name his cabin or the county foster program. He waited. For several moments, only the wind moved through the pine needles. Walter's attention settled on the brass key in his palm. Then he told them about a watch. During his military service, a young man in Walter's unit had asked him to deliver a pocket watch to his father if he did not make it home. The assignment ended. Walter returned to the United States. The father had moved, and the address on the paper no longer existed. It took Walter 11 months to find him. By then, people had told Walter the effort was unnecessary. The watch was only an object. The promise had no legal force. The father might not even want it. Walter went anyway. When a man loses control of nearly everything, he said, sometimes the one thing left is whether his word still means something. His hand tightened around the cane. "I told Eleanor I would keep Duke from being sent away before Thomas came home." Nora did not challenge the promise. Caleb understood that keeping Walter involved wasn't a courtesy. It was part of keeping the promise intact. At last, Walters agreed to a plan on one condition. No one would make decisions about Duke or Milo without speaking to him first, unless an immediate emergency left no time. Nora accepted. They began with what could be done before dark. Caleb would help clear a safe route. Walter would write the daily schedule. Nora would contact the veterinary clinic. Thomas's authorization would remain on file. A temporary indoor space still had to be chosen, but Walter would be part of that decision. The first outline of cooperation was small. It was enough. They returned to Duke's shelter to measure the path and examine the roof more carefully. Caleb checked the visible supports. Nora inspected the dry section near the blanket. Walter remained near the door, describing how snow usually drifted across the yard. Milo moved around them, smelling the boards and the edge of the wool blanket. Then the puppy stopped. His head lifted towards the rear slope of the roof, where a large pine branch hung low and concealed part of the structure beneath snow. Milo's ears shifted forward. A faint sound came from above. Not a crash, not even a snap. A small, strained complaint from old wood carrying more weight than it should. Milo gave a quiet whine and stepped backward from the shelter. Caleb looked up at the dark branch and the white burden pressed against the hidden roof. For the first time that afternoon, no one needed to argue about whether the danger was real. By 8 the next morning, Caleb Ward had already placed 3 different paths through the snow in his mind. The shortest route ran straight from Walter Boone's porch to the broken section of fence. It would require widening the opening and cutting away 2 fallen boards. The easiest route followed the edge of the neighboring driveway, where the snow was shallower. The route Walter chose was neither. The old veteran stood on his back step in an olive-gray coat, leaning on his ashwood cane, while Milo waited beside one boot. Walter pointed toward a narrow strip of ground, several feet north of the broken fence. "Start there," he said. Caleb looked at the drift covering it. "That puts the path closer to the trees. That's why it will stay open." Walter explained that the wind usually crossed Pine Hollow from the northwest. A wide path in the open yard would fill again within hours. The trees created a break in the wind, while the slight rise in the ground kept meltwater from freezing beneath the snow. Caleb had arrived prepared to solve the problem. Instead, he set down his shovel and listened. That was a smaller act than clearing a path, but it required more discipline. For most of his adult life, Caleb had trusted plans that could be drawn quickly and followed without debate. Decisions saved time. In dangerous places, hesitation carried a cost. Pine Hollow was teaching him that speed could also carry a cost when the person being helped was still capable of choosing. Walter used the end of his cane to mark the width of the path. Not wider than this. Caleb measured the distance with his eye. It was barely enough for one person and a dog. A little more room would make it easier to carry Duke. Walter shook his head. A little more room gives the north wind a place to work. Caleb accepted the correction. They began with the snow nearest Walter's porch. Caleb removed the heavy top layer. Walter followed more slowly, using a flat shovel to clean the packed surface Caleb left behind. Milo moved between them, attacking loose clumps of snow, until Walter told him he was making more work than help. The puppy sat down, as though deeply offended. By mid-morning, the path reached the fence. A yellow county plow appeared at the end of the drive, its engine low and steady. The driver parked beside Caleb's truck and climbed down, carrying a red-handled shovel. Ben Harlow was 61, broad through the chest and middle, with a close white-gray beard and a slight limp in his left leg. He drove Pine Hollow's snowplow and served on the village's volunteer rescue team. Years behind a windshield had left him with the habit of studying snowbanks the way other men studied faces. Ben greeted Walter first. That detail was not lost on Caleb. Walter explained the proposed route. Ben walked the length of it, pressed the shovel handle into 2 drifts, and looked toward the pines. "He's right," Ben said. "You cut it wide. The next north wind will bury it." Walter did not smile, but his shoulders settled. Ben then examined the main driveway serving Eleanor's empty house. If the coming storm shifted east, the road could disappear beneath a drift from the open field. The plow might reach the front gate, but there was no promise it could turn safely near the house. Walter pointed toward the rang of pines at the eastern edge of the properties. There used to be another way. Caleb had noticed Milo's older tracks there the previous day. The abandoned trail curved through the trees, crossed a shallow drainage line, and reached Eleanor's backyard from higher ground. Ben studied the opening between the pines. "Could be useful if we clear it." Walter warned that no one had fully opened the trail in years. A fallen branch might block it. The drainage line could also freeze beneath loose snow. Ben took the red-handled shovel from his shoulder. "Then we don't call it a road yet." The 3 men worked for the next 2 hours. Caleb and Ben cleared the entrance, while Walter directed them from firmer ground. Milo followed the familiar scent path a short distance into the trees, then returned whenever the snow rose above his chest. The puppy was eager, but his small body tired quickly. Walter eventually lifted him over one drift and carried him back beneath one arm. They reached the first bend before the snowfall thickened. The trail ahead remained blocked by brush and a fallen pine limb. Ben marked the position with a strip of yellow cloth so they could find it if visibility worsened. "We've got the beginning of a way," Ben said. "Not the whole way." That distinction mattered. Nothing they had done was complete. It was only preparation, and preparation was often the quiet work that kept an emergency from becoming a tragedy. When they returned to Walter's house, Mabel Cross was standing on the porch with 2 grocery bags. Her cranberry sweater showed beneath a teal winter coat. The red cord attached to her glasses had become tangled with her scarf, and she was trying to free it without putting down the bags. Mabel had brought soup, bread, canned food, and what she described as a few things Walter might need. Walter looked inside the first bag. "What I need is not tomato soup." Mabel's mouth opened. Caleb could see the apology forming before she spoke it. Walter stopped her by handing over a folded page from his pocket. "Duke needs this food. Soft variety. Not the kind with large pieces. The clinic sells it, but the store can order it." Mabel read the list. Her eyes moved once toward Milo, who was sitting beside a full bowl of food. The rumor she had helped spread now stood before her as something smaller and meaner than she had intended. Mabel did not defend herself. "I'll order 2 cases," she said. Walter corrected her. 1 case would be enough until Thomas returned. He also specified the size of the cans and the amount Duke ate at each meal. Mabel wrote every detail in her red order book. Her apology did not disappear. It changed form. Sometimes grace arrived as forgiveness spoken aloud. Sometimes it arrived as a person finally following instructions, instead of assuming they already knew what was needed. Mabel agreed to keep Eleanor's spare key after Nora Hale placed it in a sealed envelope. Ben promised to check both driveways after each plow run. Caleb's truck would remain available if Duke needed veterinary care. Walter would continue managing food, medication, and daily decisions. Nora kept Thomas's written authorization in the county file. It was not yet a community network. It was 5 names connected by specific responsibilities. That afternoon, Caleb and Ben began repairing Duke's shelter. They replaced a loose wallboard, reinforced the doorframe, and installed 2 visible braces beneath the front half of the roof. Walter remained close, checking measurements from his folding chair and reminding them not to move Eleanor's blue-gray blanket farther than necessary. Duke did not appreciate the work. At the first strike of Caleb's hammer, the old dog lowered himself fully onto the blanket and refused to move. His cloudy eyes followed every tool. When Ben shifted a board, Duke turned his face toward the rear wall. Caleb tried placing softened food near the doorway. Duke ignored it. Walter called the dog's name, but Duke remained pressed against the blanket. Milo watched from outside the shelter. The puppy approached the dented aluminum bowl, caught the rim between his teeth, and carried it several feet away from the hammering. He set it near the open side of the yard. Duke lifted his head. Milo returned to the shelter and searched beside the blanket until he found an old rubber ball, faded nearly gray. He pushed it with his nose, caught it awkwardly in his mouth, and carried that beside the bowl. Duke shifted one front leg beneath himself. Milo went back a 3rd time. This time, the puppy caught the loose corner of Eleanor's wool blanket. He could move only a small fold of it before the rest caught beneath Duke's body. Milo pulled once, stopped when Duke resisted, then lay beside the exposed corner. The puppy waited. Duke looked toward the bowl, then toward the ball, then toward Milo. Slowly, the old dog stood. His rear legs trembled before they straightened. Milo backed away 1 step. Duke followed. Milo moved another step, careful now, no longer pulling at the blanket. Duke crossed the shelter threshold. No leash tightened around his neck. No hands lifted him. The old dog chose to move because something he trusted had made the new space feel connected to the old one. Caleb stopped working. So did Ben. Walter said nothing, but his hand closed around the handle of his cane. Milo led Duke into the cleared section beside the shelter. The puppy lay down near the bowl, and Duke settled beside him. Only then did Caleb return to the roof brace. By late afternoon, they had repaired everything visible from below. The front wall stood firm. The door opened cleanly. The exposed supports no longer shifted under pressure. The rear section remained difficult to inspect. A heavy pine branch extended over the shelter, hiding part of the roof beneath needles and packed snow. Caleb used a long pole to test the edge he could reach. Nothing moved. He considered climbing higher for a closer look, but the light was fading, and the snow around the rear wall had formed a deep, unstable drift. Ben advised waiting until morning, when they could bring a ladder and clear the branch safely. Walter agreed. It was a reasonable choice based on what they could see. None of them could see the old crossbeam beneath the rear roof, where moisture had worked into the wood over many winters. Nora returned before dark. She examined Milo again, reviewed Walter's notebook, and confirmed that the puppy was healthy and properly cared for. She also reviewed Thomas's authorization and the responsibilities assigned to each person. Duke now had a legal caretaker, a daily schedule, emergency transport, a plowed access plan, and several people who knew what to do. Nora approved the arrangement for the time being. She remained concerned about the shelter roof. If the weather worsens, Duke needs an indoor place, she said. Walter had cleared a corner of his mudroom and placed an old rug there. Duke had refused to enter the previous day, but the space was ready. Nora accepted that as the temporary backup plan. She asked them to monitor the roof and move Duke if the structure began shifting. Her approval was not a declaration that every problem had been solved. It was permission to continue carefully. That evening, after Ben, Mabel, and Nora had left, Caleb sat with Walter on the back porch. The snow had paused. A pale strip of evening remained above the trees. Caleb poured coffee from his dented navy thermos into 2 metal cups. Milo lay between their chairs. His head rested against Walter's boot, while one front paw touched the side of Caleb's work shoe. Walter looked down at the puppy. "Eleanor used to leave Pi here after my wife died," he said. Caleb waited. Walter explained that Eleanor never knocked. She knew he would refuse the pie if she handed it to him. Instead, she placed it beside the door and went home before he could object. She understood a man can need kindness and still hate the feeling of owing for it. Caleb turned the warm cup in his hands. Years earlier, a teammate had suffered an injury during a mission and refused to leave his position. The man believed evacuation would make him weak in the eyes of the unit. Caleb had ordered him removed. The order had been necessary. What Caleb regretted was everything he had failed to say afterward. "I got him out," Caleb said. "I never helped him understand that leaving did not make him less of a man." Walter looked toward the dark outline of Eleanor's house. "Orders are quicker than understanding." "They are." The old veteran took a drink of coffee. Neither man apologized for who he had been. They simply sat near the truth long enough to recognize it. Milo shifted in his sleep, keeping contact with both pairs of boots. Above the neighboring yard, the pine branches began moving. The wind had changed. It no longer crossed from the northwest. It came from the open eastern field, lifting loose snow from the ground and carrying it toward Duke's shelter. Caleb watched the first white stream curl over the fence. Across the yard, snow began collecting behind the low pine branch, pressing quietly onto the hidden rear slope of the roof. The storm reached Pine Hollow before the village had finished preparing for it. By 9 that night, the main road had vanished beneath wind-driven snow. The street lamps still glowed, but their light ended only a few feet beyond each pole. Pine branches struck one another in the darkness, and the power dimmed often enough to make every house seem to inhale and hold its breath. Walter Boone had moved Milo's bed into his bedroom so the puppy would not sleep near the draft, beneath the back door. Milo had other plans. The 12-week-old German Shepherd settled on the rug beside Walter's bed, but kept lifting his head toward the neighboring yard. His right ear stood almost straight. The left leaned outward, following each new sound in the storm. Walter had checked Duke before darkness. The old dog had eaten half a serving of softened food and was lying on Eleanor's blue-gray blanket. The visible braces beneath the front roof remained firm. Walter had left the mudroom ready in case Duke needed to be moved indoors. Everything that could reasonably be prepared had been prepared. That did not mean everything was safe. Shortly after 10, Milo rose. The puppy stood completely still, facing the rear wall. Walter heard only wind. Milo took 2 steps toward the bedroom door. Then came a low sound from across the property. Not loud enough to shake the house, but deeper than a branch brushing siding. Wood under strain. Milo ran into the hallway. Walter pushed himself upright and reached for the cane beside his bed. Before he had both feet on the floor, Milo returned carrying the left brown glove Walter normally wore when crossing to Duke's shelter. The glove dragged between the puppy's front legs. Milo placed it on Walter's slipper and looked toward the back door. Walter remembered the last time the puppy had carried that glove. He remembered lying in the snow, unable to stand, while Milo ran toward the road with the only object that seemed connected to both Walter and the trouble behind him. The old man pulled on his trousers, coat, and boots. Milo waited beside the door. When Walter opened it, the wind forced snow across the mudroom floor. Beyond the porch light, the fence had nearly disappeared. Then, something gave way in Eleanor's yard. The sound was not a full collapse. It was a heavy, uneven drop, followed by the sliding rush of snow. Walter stepped off the porch. His cane sank nearly to the handle. He tried a second step. His right knee failed to hold him, and he caught himself against the railing before falling. Milo bounded into the snow, then stopped. The puppy looked toward Duke's shelter. He looked back at Walter. Instead of continuing alone, Milo returned and pressed his body against Walter's lower leg. Walter's first instinct was anger, at the storm, at his knee, at the simple fact that intention no longer guaranteed ability. Then he understood what Milo was doing. The puppy would not leave Duke, but he would not lead Walter into danger either. Walter stepped backward onto the porch. He closed the door, reached for the telephone, and called Caleb Ward. It was the first time Walter had asked him to come. Caleb answered before the second ring. Walter told him the rear roof of Duke's shelter had partially fallen, and that the main approach might be blocked. He described the sound, the direction of the wind, and the last place Duke had been lying. Caleb did not waste time asking whether Walter was certain. He told Walter to remain inside, keep Milo with him, and find the handheld radio they had used while clearing the path. Walter objected only once. Duke may not have time for a committee. Caleb's answer remained calm. That is why I'm calling Ben while I drive. Within minutes, Caleb's pickup appeared as two dull lights moving through the storm. He parked near Walter's front steps because the rear drive had already filled with snow. Caleb wore his charcoal parka and dark snow bibs. A clear pair of protective glasses rested over his eyes. A safety line crossed one shoulder, and he carried blankets, a chest light, a short probe pole, and basic hand tools. Ben Harlow's plow followed behind. The large vehicle could clear the village road as far as Walter's entrance, but the narrow approach to Eleanor's house was blocked by a young pine that had fallen across the fence. Snow had collected around the trunk, making it too slow to remove before reaching Duke. Ben climbed down with a rescue bag and folded soft stretcher. Walter stood inside the open doorway, the radio in one hand. The old trail, he said, through the eastern pines. Caleb looked toward the darkness beyond the houses. They had cleared only the first section the previous day. Walter described the route again. It began behind the woodpile, curved around the high ground, crossed the shallow drainage line, then approached Eleanor's yard from behind the shelter. Ben confirmed that the route avoided the open field, where the wind was strongest. Milo pulled toward the eastern side of the house. Caleb clipped a long lead to the puppy's green collar. Milo knows the entrance, Walter said. After that, listen to me and Ben. He's still a pup. It was not a warning against trusting Milo. It was Walter protecting him from being asked to become something he was not. Caleb entered the trees with Milo several feet ahead. Ben followed, carrying the stretcher and an additional rope. The pines reduced the wind, but trapped deeper snow between their trunks. Milo pushed forward in short bursts. Sometimes his front legs disappeared almost to his chest. Each time, Caleb lifted him over the deepest section, or allowed him to rest before moving again. The puppy repeatedly looked back. He was not leading with the certainty of a trained search dog. He was following a path remembered through scent, habit, and the need to reach a familiar friend. Walter's voice came through the radio. First, Ben should put a split pine on your left. Caleb found it beneath a white covering. Ben confirmed the yellow strip of cloth they had tied there the day before. The trail was no longer visible, but the marker proved they were on the right line. They moved past the fallen branch that had stopped their earlier work. The ground descended slightly. Milo slowed. He lowered his nose close to the snow, then stepped sideways. A hollow, crusting sound came from beneath his front paw. The puppy backed away and smelled toward a narrow depression. Caleb halted. He used the probe pole ahead of him. The first two places held firm. The third gave way with almost no resistance. Beneath the snow was the shallow drainage line Walter had warned them about. Water still moved under a skin of ice. Milo had not understood the shape or danger of the ditch. He had only heard a change beneath the surface and smelled what the snow had hidden. That was enough. Caleb marked the weak section and led Ben around it on higher ground. The shelter appeared several minutes later. The pine branch over the rear roof had caught a large drift. One end of the old structure had folded inward beneath the weight. Snow covered part of the wall, but the front section remained standing. Caleb approached from the side, keeping Milo behind him until he had checked the visible supports. "Duke," Caleb called. A rough, frightened sound answered from inside. The old dog was alive. Caleb directed his chest light through a gap near the doorway. Duke had retreated beside the low wooden table. The table and front wall had created a protected space, but broken boards blocked the easiest exit. Caleb removed loose snow by hand before using a short pry bar. Ben secured a rope around one stable post, giving Caleb a safety point if the surrounding snow shifted. Walter remained on the radio. "The blanket was left of the table," he said. Duke usually turns toward the back wall when frightened. Caleb found the edge of the blue-gray wool beneath Duke's front legs. He widened the gap enough for the old dog to pass. Duke did not move. The shelter creaked when the wind pressed against it. Duke lowered his body and turned his head away from Caleb's light. Caleb tried the old dog's name again, using Walter's slower tone. Duke remained beneath the table. Milo whined behind Caleb. Caleb checked the opening one more time. The front space was stable. The puppy could enter without moving beneath the collapsed section, but the choice still carried risk. He looked at Ben. Ben kept one hand on the rope. "Only the clear side." Caleb shortened Milo's lead and guided him to the opening. The puppy entered low beneath the intact front board. Milo did not rush toward Duke. He stopped at the edge of the blanket, lowering himself until his belly touched the floor. Then he moved close enough to touch his nose to Duke's silver muzzle. Duke's breathing remained quick. Milo lay beside him. For several seconds, nothing changed. The roof complained again. Caleb held the gap open and waited. Milo stood, stepped backward, then looked at Duke. When the old dog did not follow, the puppy returned and pressed his shoulder lightly against Duke's chest. This was the same patient movement Milo had used when bringing Duke food and leading him away from the hammering. Not force. An invitation repeated until fear loosened its grip. Duke placed one front paw forward. Milo backed toward the opening. Duke's rear legs trembled as he stood. He stopped when a loose board scraped overhead, but Milo remained in sight. One step followed another. Caleb reached beneath Duke's chest only when the old dog reached the narrowest part. He supported the weight without pulling. Duke came out into the snow. Ben immediately wrapped the old dog in a thick blanket. Duke could walk on the firmer sections, but the trail through the pines was too deep for his stiff rear legs. They placed him on the soft stretcher. Milo walked close beside Duke's head. On the return route, Walter warned them that the wind had strengthened near the eastern edge of the trees. He directed them toward a low rise, protected by several thick trunks. "Stay west of the split pine," Walter said through the radio. "The tall trees east of it lose branches when the wind comes this way." Moments later, a heavy limb fell somewhere beyond the rise. Caleb heard the crash, but never saw it through the snow. Walter had not entered the woods. His knowledge had. That knowledge kept the rescuers away from the most dangerous section and guided them back toward the first marker. Ben signaled his plow when they reached the edge of the trees. Its horn sounded twice. Lights appeared near Walter's driveway as several villagers arrived with shovels, lanterns, and extra blankets. Mabel Cross stood among them, her teal coat covered with snow. No one asked Walter why he had not gone himself. They had heard his voice on Ben's radio. They had watched Caleb and Ben follow the route Walter chose. They understood that remaining at the house had not made Walter useless. It had allowed him to lead. Duke was carried into Walter's mudroom and placed on the old rug prepared the day before. The room was warmer than the shelter, but still close enough to the back door for familiar winter scents to enter. Duke lifted his head once. Milo crawled beneath the edge of the blanket and lay against the old dog's chest. The puppy ignored his own food and water. He remained beside Duke until the old dog's breathing slowed. Walter lowered himself onto the floor with care. He placed one hand on Milo's head. "I promised she wouldn't leave Duke waiting alone," Walter said. His fingers moved gently behind Milo's uneven ears. "But you're the one who kept that promise every day." No one in the room answered. The words did not need witnesses, yet everyone heard them. By early morning, the storm had weakened enough for Caleb and Ben to return to the shelter. They needed to retrieve Duke's blanket box, feeding records, and anything that could be damaged by melting snow. The rear roof was beyond repair. The front section still stood, but Caleb entered only after Ben secured the remaining wall. They pulled the low wooden blanket box away from the collapsed boards. Its base felt heavier on one side. Ben noticed a thin seam beneath the inner panel. Caleb removed 2 small screws and lifted a false bottom. Inside lay a single sealed envelope, dry and protected from the snow. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor Vance. Caleb read the words aloud so Ben could hear them over the fading wind. For Walter and Thomas, open only when the promise becomes too heavy for one person to carry. Morning came to Pine Hollow without sunrise. The storm had passed east, but a low gray sky remained over the village. Snow covered the broken branches, the buried fence, and what was left of Duke's shelter. The world looked quiet again, though the quiet no longer felt innocent. Inside Walter Boone's mudroom, Duke slept on the old rug beneath 2 blankets. Milo lay pressed against the older dog's side. The German Shepherd puppy had eaten only after Duke accepted a few bites of softened food. Even then, Milo returned immediately to the rug, as though leaving for too long might allow the previous night to happen again. Caleb Ward stood near the kitchen table with the second envelope in his hand. The paper was dry despite the collapsed shelter. Eleanor Vance had sealed it carefully, then hidden it beneath the false bottom of the blanket box. Her handwriting crossed the front in a steady line. For Walter and Thomas, open only when the promise becomes too heavy for one person to carry. The first letter, addressed only to Thomas, remained sealed inside Walter's coat pocket. No one had touched it. This letter was different. Walter sat beside the stove with his injured leg extended beneath the table. He had changed into a brown cardigan and dark wool trousers, but exhaustion still showed around his eyes. The previous night had cost him even though he had never entered the woods. Leading from a doorway was still leading. Waiting beside a radio while others carried out the work was still a kind of strain. Caleb placed the second envelope on the table. "We need Thomas's permission," Walter said. Caleb agreed. Thomas answered the video call from a small hospital waiting room. He looked older than he had sounded on the telephone. His brown hair was streaked with silver and slightly uncombed. Dark shadows rested beneath his eyes. Behind him, a vending machine hummed beside an empty row of chairs. Walter explained where the letter had been found and read the words from the front. Thomas lowered his face for several seconds. When he looked up, he said they should open it. "My mother wrote both our names," Thomas said. "You shouldn't have to wait for me to get there." Walter used a small knife to lift the seal. His hands were careful, almost ceremonial. He unfolded 2 pages covered in Eleanor's narrow handwriting. Walter began reading aloud. Eleanor thanked him first. She wrote that he had stood beside her through years, when the village had grown smaller, when friends had moved away, and age had made ordinary tasks more difficult. She thanked him for repairing her porch steps, checking the furnace, and pretending not to notice when she left pies outside his door. Walter stopped. Caleb saw the old man's thumb press into the fold of the page. Then Walter continued. Eleanor wrote that she knew exactly what he would do if she asked him to care for Duke. Walter would give his word. After that, he would carry the responsibility alone until his body failed beneath it. She loved him for that loyalty. She also feared it. Walter's voice slowed over the next lines. Eleanor did not want Duke removed in haste, simply because people were uncomfortable with responsibility. The old dog had already lost enough. He deserved time, familiar ground, and the presence of those he trusted. But Eleanor did not want Walter to fall in the snow, hide his pain, or mistake suffering for proof that his promise still mattered. She asked Thomas not to bring Duke away, only because guilt demanded a visible act of devotion. She asked Walter not to refuse every hand, simply because accepting one felt like surrender. Then came a memory of Thomas's father. Before his death, Eleanor's husband had once told her that a family was not measured only by who slept beneath the same roof. A family was made of the people who returned when someone, or some faithful creature, was still waiting at the door. Eleanor's final request was simple. Do not let Duke wait alone. Do not make one person carry what several loving people can protect together. Walter stopped reading. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the stove settling, and Duke breathing in the next room. On the video screen, Thomas removed his glasses and wiped them with the edge of his sweater. The motion did not hide the grief in his face. Thomas said his daughter's surgery had been the main reason for his absence. She had needed help standing, eating, and managing the medication schedule. For days, leaving her had been impossible, but her condition had improved earlier than Walter knew. A physician had told Thomas 3 days ago that she could soon manage with help from a visiting nurse. Thomas had still delayed. He had told himself he was waiting for final clearance. The truth was that he was afraid of returning to the empty house where his mother's coat would still hang near the door. He was afraid Duke would search behind him for Eleanor. Most of all, Thomas feared that arriving too late would reveal something he could never repair. I thought taking Duke home would prove I had come back for something, Thomas said. His voice became unsteady, but he did not turn away from the camera. Walter looked towards the mudroom. Milo had raised his head at Thomas's voice. The puppy listened for a moment, then rested his chin against Duke again. Walter understood the gesture before anyone explained it. Thomas wasn't careless. He was ashamed. Shame had kept Walter from calling for help. It had kept Thomas from crossing the final distance home. The two men had chosen different forms of delay, but both had believed they needed to arrive as stronger men than they felt. Walter folded Eleanor's letter. I thought keeping my word meant nobody else should have to touch it, he said. Thomas replaced his glasses. Neither man offered the other an easy pardon. They did something more useful. They remained present. Thomas promised to leave for Pine Hollow the following morning. His daughter's nurse had been confirmed, and another family member would remain with her overnight. Before ending the call, Thomas asked Walter to keep the first letter sealed. I want to read that one in her house, he said. Walter agreed. After the screen went dark, Caleb poured fresh coffee into 2 cups. Walter stared at Eleanor's letter. She knew me too well. Caleb sat across from him. Sometimes that is how God sends help, through somebody who knows which door we keep locked. Walter gave a tired, almost amused breath. Caleb told him that Eleanor's words had not erased the promise. They had revealed its proper size. A promise does not become weaker when more people protect it, Caleb said. Walter looked at him. You believe that now? The question reached farther than Duke. Caleb considered the teammate he had ordered out of danger years earlier. He had believed being responsible meant remaining the strongest man in the room. Even afterward, he had carried the decision alone, never speaking to the man about the shame that came with being removed. I'm beginning to, Caleb said. Walter feared that needing help would make him less valuable. Caleb feared that sharing responsibility would make him less necessary. Both beliefs had left men standing alone beside burdens that were never meant for one set of shoulders. By noon, the kitchen table held Eleanor's letter, Walter's care notebook, Nora Hale's forms, and Caleb's orange inspection pad. This time, no one announced a solution for Walter. They built one with him. Walter would continue making the daily decisions about Duke's meals, medication, and routine. Thomas would remain the legal owner and cover veterinary expenses. Caleb would serve as the emergency contact and provide transportation. Mabel Cross would keep the sealed spare key. Ben Harlow would include both properties in his priority snow route and make certain rescue vehicles could reach the driveway. Nora would retain Thomas's authorization and arrange temporary foster care only if Walter requested it or a true emergency made the houses unsafe. A veterinarian would examine Duke before Thomas made any decision about a long journey. Walter read each responsibility twice. Then he signed his name beneath the plan. He did not sign as a man surrendering control. He signed as the person directing how help would be given. That afternoon, people began arriving with lumber. The change in Pine Hollow remained imperfect. Some villagers came because Ben had told them what Walter had done during the rescue. Others came because Mabel had quietly corrected the rumor she once helped spread. A few still seemed uncertain how to speak to Walter. Walter solved that problem by giving everyone work. The new shelter would stand near the repaired section of fence. It would have insulated walls, a lower entrance for Duke, and enough roof pitch to prevent heavy snow from collecting. Most importantly, it would have 2 doors. One would open toward Eleanor's yard. The other would open toward Walter's house. Caleb marked the foundation posts, but Walter chose the placement. Ben checked the distance from the plowed drive. Mabel recorded the supplies still needed. They completed only the frame before the afternoon light began to fade. Duke watched from the mudroom doorway. The old dog had shown little interest in leaving the warm rug. The hammering made his ears shift backward, and his stiff rear legs discouraged him from moving farther. Milo ran through one empty door frame. The puppy crossed the unfinished shelter, disappeared through the opposite opening, then returned. He repeated the path before stopping inside the wooden frame. Duke raised his head. Milo sat down and waited. The old dog stood slowly. Walter did not call him. Caleb did not reach for a leash. Duke stepped onto the cleared path. He moved no farther than the edge of the new structure. Milo came back to meet him, then walked beside him through the first open doorway. Together, the 2 dogs stood beneath a roof that did not yet exist. The image held the meaning of Eleanor's letter better than any explanation could. Duke did not have to abandon the yard where he had waited. Walter did not have to become the only door left open. As evening approached, Thomas called once more. His voice was steadier. He had booked an early flight and arranged a rental car for the remaining drive through the mountains. He expected to reach Pine Hollow the following morning. Thomas also stated what he planned to do. Unless the veterinarian believed the trip would place too much strain on Duke, Thomas intended to take the old dog home with him. Walter looked through the kitchen window. Outside, Milo sat inside the unfinished shelter, while Duke rested near the opening closest to Eleanor's yard. The promise was no longer resting on Walter alone, but the final choice had not yet been made. By the time Thomas Vance reached Pine Hollow, winter had begun loosening its hold on the village. Snow still covered the roofs and shaded yards, but water dripped steadily from the eaves. Brown grass appeared along the edges of the main road. Beneath the pines, narrow streams carried meltwater through channels that had been hidden for months. Thomas arrived shortly after 9 in the morning. His rental car stopped beside Walter Boone's house, where the newly cleared path connected the two properties. Thomas remained behind the wheel for several seconds before opening the door. Caleb Ward watched from Walter's porch. Thomas looked much like his mother around the eyes. He was 50, with brown hair streaked heavily with silver, and a neatly trimmed beard that had grown uneven during the weeks at the hospital. He wore a gray-blue winter coat and carried a folded family blanket beneath one arm. In his other hand was a worn leather collar. A cream-colored envelope of photographs rested on the passenger seat behind him. Duke stood inside Walter's mudroom. The old dog had heard the car, though perhaps not clearly. His head rose when Thomas crossed the porch. Milo moved close to Duke's shoulder, watching the unfamiliar man with quiet attention. Thomas entered slowly. He did not call Duke's name from across the room. He lowered himself near the doorway and placed the old collar on the floor. The brass tag made a faint sound against the wood. Duke's nose lifted. The old dog took one step, then another. His rear legs remained stiff, but his attention stayed fixed on the scent carried by the collar and blanket. When Duke reached Thomas, he did not jump or bark. He rested his silver muzzle against Thomas's knee. Thomas closed both hands around the old dog's head and bent forward until his forehead touched Duke's. No one spoke. Milo approached after several moments. He smelled Thomas's sleeve, then the leather collar, before sitting beside Duke. His left ear leaned outward, while the right stood almost straight. Thomas looked at the puppy. "So you're Milo?" Walter stood near the kitchen doorway with his cane. "That's the one who kept your dog fed when the rest of us ran out of good ideas." Thomas did not correct the words, "your dog." Not yet. Before any decision could be made, Duke had an appointment at the veterinary clinic in the neighboring county. Caleb drove because Thomas had spent the previous day traveling, and because Duke already knew the sound and smell of Caleb's truck. Milo remained with Walter. At the clinic, Dr. Lydia Marin examined Duke while Thomas, Caleb, and Walter listened. Walter had insisted on coming, though Caleb had to help him over the icy section near the entrance. Dr. Marin was 58, with short gray curls and the unhurried manner of someone who understood that old animals needed time before they offered trust. She checked Duke's heart, lungs, joints, hearing response, hydration, and the stiffness in his rear legs. The examination found no acute illness. Duke's heart remained steady. His lungs were clear. He had lost some muscle with age and had mild arthritis through his hips and lower spine. His hearing had declined, and the storm had left him more watchful than before, but he was eating again and resting normally near Milo. The question was not whether Duke could survive a long journey. He probably could. The question was what the journey would cost him afterward. To Bomb, Marin explained that several days of driving, followed by a completely unfamiliar house, yard, climate, and routine, could increase confusion and anxiety in an old dog. Duke might adjust with time, but there was no medical reason to force that adjustment if a safe and stable arrangement already existed. At Pine Hollow, Duke had Walter's routine, Caleb's transport, Ben's plowed access, Mabel's spare key, Nora's care plan, a new shelter, and Milo. Dr. Marin looked directly at Thomas. "I cannot make the decision for you," she said, "but duty is not always measured by how far you carry someone. Sometimes it is measured by whether you recognize where they are already safe." Thomas listened without arguing. That afternoon, he entered Eleanor's house for the first time since her death. The air was cold, but clean. Mabel had checked the pipes, and Caleb had kept the heat low enough to protect the rooms. Eleanor's blue coat still hung beside the door. A pair of garden shoes remained beneath the bench. Thomas carried the first sealed letter to the kitchen table. Walter and Caleb waited outside. The letter belonged to Thomas alone. He remained in the house nearly 40 minutes. When he finally returned, The pages were folded inside the original envelope. Thomas's eyes were red, but his posture had changed. He no longer moved like a man rushing to complete a task before grief caught him. He sat on Eleanor's back step and told Walter only what he wished to share. His mother had not blamed him for living far away. She knew he had a wife, a daughter, work, and obligations she had once encouraged him to build. She had written that love did not become false simply because distance made it imperfect. Her final request was the same one hidden beneath every other instruction. Do not make a decision from guilt and call it devotion. Thomas looked toward the yard, where the two-door shelter stood nearly complete. I thought taking Duke home would prove I hadn't abandoned her, he said. Walter lowered himself into a chair beside the steps. Your mother didn't ask for proof, Walter said. She asked us to pay attention to the dog. That was what they did. Thomas brought out the family blanket. It carried the familiar sense of his home and older traces of Eleanor's house. He spread it near his car and placed Duke's old collar on top. Duke crossed the yard slowly. He smelled the blanket for a long time. Then he moved to Thomas and leaned his head against the man's thigh. Thomas stroked the silver fur behind Duke's ear. The bond between them had not disappeared. Thomas opened the rear door of the car. A padded bed waited inside, along with water and a ramp Caleb had secured to the frame. No one called Duke forward. The old dog approached the ramp. He placed one front paw on it, then the other. For a moment, Thomas stopped breathing. Duke looked into the car. Then he turned his head toward Eleanor's house. Across the yard, Milo stood inside the open gate between the two properties. The puppy did not bark or run toward Duke. He simply lowered himself beside the gate, his front paws stretched across the melting snow. Duke stepped away from the ramp. He walked past Thomas, paused near Eleanor's porch, and continued toward the gate. When he reached Milo, the old dog lowered himself carefully and lay beside him. Milo pressed his shoulder against Duke's chest. Thomas watched them. Duke's choice was not the only evidence. Dr. Marin's examination mattered. The care plan mattered. Walter's records mattered. The people standing nearby mattered. But the old dog's movement gave all those facts a voice. Thomas closed the car door. He formally authorized Duke to remain in Pine Hollow. He would keep legal ownership, pay the veterinary bills, return for scheduled visits, and be consulted on every major medical decision. Walter would continue managing Duke's food, medication, and daily routine. Caleb would remain the emergency contact. No one congratulated Walter, as though he had won Duke in a contest. Nothing had been won. A decision had simply been made in the old dog's best interest. The new shelter was completed 2 days later. One door opened toward Eleanor's yard. The other faced Walter's house. The gate between the properties was repaired, but no longer locked. Mabel placed the village's new emergency contact book on Walter's kitchen table. In front of Caleb, Ben, Nora, and Thomas, she admitted that her rumor had caused real harm. I looked at a bowl and decided I knew the whole story, she said. Walter opened the book. He studied the large, slanted handwriting covering the first page. This is supposed to help during an emergency? Mabel adjusted her glasses. You can read it. Only if the emergency lasts 3 days. The laughter that followed was small but honest. Walter handed the book back to her and told her to rewrite the numbers more clearly. It was not a speech of forgiveness. It was better suited to Walter than a speech would have been. He gave Mabel work that mattered. Ben added every home with an elderly resident and an animal to his priority plow map. Nora helped Pine Hollow create a simple emergency network. Each household could record a spare key holder, veterinary number, feeding instructions, medication list, temporary caregiver, legal decision maker, and safe route during severe weather. The system was built from ordinary things: names, keys, phone numbers, people agreeing to answer. Caleb began stopping at Walter's house most afternoons after work. Sometimes they repaired hinges or split firewood. Sometimes they drank coffee, while Duke slept near the stove and Milo searched Caleb's coat pockets for the brown work glove he had learned to steal. Neither man called those visits healing. They did not need to. By the first week of spring thaw, Thomas returned to Pine Hollow for a weekend. The three men stood near the open gate while meltwater ran beneath the fence. Duke rested in a patch of weak sunlight. Milo discovered the old aluminum bowl beside the new shelter and picked it up by the dented rim. The puppy carried the bowl through the gate. It no longer held food, meant to be passed secretly beneath broken boards. Walter had cleaned it and filled it each morning as a shared water bowl between the 2 yards. Milo placed it on the ground between Caleb, Walter, and Thomas. Then he returned to Duke and lay against the old dog's side. The bowl had once convinced Pine Hollow that a puppy was being neglected. Now it stood in an open gateway, surrounded by people who had learned to look more carefully. Caleb watched Walter reach down to touch Milo's head. Thomas rested one hand on Duke's shoulder. There had been a time when Caleb believed helping meant taking the burden before someone weaker dropped it. Pine Hollow had taught him something quieter. Real help did not always remove responsibility from another person's hands. Sometimes it cleared a path through deep snow. Sometimes it built a gate wide enough for love to move in both directions. And sometimes, by the grace of God, it simply stood close enough that no one had to keep a promise alone. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is not take someone's burden away, but help them carry it without losing their dignity. Walter did not need to be replaced. He needed people willing to stand beside him. And Milo reminded everyone that loyalty is not about holding on alone. It is about making sure no one is left waiting. In our own lives, there may be someone who needs help but is afraid to ask. May God give us the wisdom to listen before we act, and the grace to offer support without taking away another person's voice. If this story meant something to you, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you would like more stories about loyalty, hope, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May peace be with you and your loved ones.